Russian President Vladimir Putin officially opened the Paralympic Games in Sochi, but not without a symbolic protest from Ukraine. The team sent a single flag bearer into the opening ceremony, while the rest of the team opted not to march. It highlights the ongoing tension now focused on the Crimea region.
Now, to talk about this and other stories of the week, we're joined by Bruce Hawker, who is the Managing Director of Campaigns and Communications Group, and Julian Leeser, who is the Director of Government Policy and Strategy at the Australian Catholic University. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let's obviously start with Ukraine. Now, we've seen overnight there was a limited boycott, I guess, of the Paralympic Games opening ceremony. Do these boycotts actually have an effect? I mean, what is the Kremlin sitting back and thinking of the West's actions at the moment, do you think, Julian?
I don't think it was really a boycott. It was a protest of some sort. Look, it's obviously embarrassing for the Kremlin, but I think Vladimir Putin doesn't care so much about this. He seems to just want to tough this out. He had that 4-hour press conference the other night where he was trying to explain Russia's actions and involvement in the Crimea. I think it's a terrible situation that you've got there, where you've got the army of one country sitting on the border of, or sitting right inside the another country, keeping another country's army sitting there in its barracks. You've had long tensions in the Ukraine between those Ukrainians who are pro-Russian and those Ukrainians who want a greater integration into Europe, and that's very much what the latest tensions have been all about, because the former Ukrainian leader wanted greater European integration, wanted greater Russian integration, and the protests were all about people saying, well, no, actually that's not the direction we want. Crimea is unique in that it has always had a significant Russian population and really has only been part of the Ukraine since Khrushchev, who was a Ukrainian by background, gave the Crimea to the Ukraine in the 1950s. But, you know, we're going to have this sham referendum that's going to happen in a week with slanted questions. What does the Ukrainian government do other than sit by and call for international assistance? And I think that's what they've done at the moment. I'm not sure they have very many other options.
Do you think the message has been strong enough?
Well, I don't really think it matters how strong the message is. I think Putin's going to do what Putin's going to do. I mean, I think he would regard, for all the wrong reasons, the Crimea as being part of his backyard, and what the international community says or does isn't going to reflect too much on him. I think he sees himself now as very much a major international player, and this has given him an opportunity to flex his muscles within Russia as well. So I can't see big changes happening in terms of them backing down anyway in the face of American or other protests about it. So I think they will do what they will do.
Bruce, just a bit of clarification. The media, or parts of the media, got very excited during the week when they discovered that Kevin Rudd was on his way to Moscow, but also supposedly to Ukraine. You've spoken with him. Tell us the story. What's actually happened?
Yeah, I got a bit alarmed by that as well. But I spoke to him the other night. He was in Moscow, and he said, look, it's got absolutely nothing to do with anything to do with the Ukraine or the Crimea. He was there as part of a trip associated with the Harvard University, where he's now taken up an appointment. So someone put 2 and 2 together and got about 22. So.
All right, let's move on and come home to domestic politics. Now, Julian, we've heard from Prime Minister Tony Abbott the other night talking about unlocking the forests, and in particular in Tasmania, which has alarmed certainly the Greens and the conservation movement. What should we expect from Tony Abbott? What was he flagging?
He was flagging unlocking 74,000 hectares there of Tasmanian forest, delisting it from the World Heritage listing. If you look at the Tasmanian economy, it is the most backward economy in the country. There's been no new jobs created there for several years. Forestry is one of its great industries. The Australian forestry industry in Tasmania is one of the cleanest and most sustainable industries, forestry industries around the world, and yet it's been very much locked up and locked away. And Tony Abbott has really been calling for a re-swinging of the pendulum back to a more pro-forestry position more generally. The Forestry Industry Association had its conference in in Canberra. He was making a speech at their annual conference dinner. It was really to send a signal that people in Tasmania ahead of the election need to think about the government there and to elect a government that is going to be pro-jobs and pro the forestry industry, and that's the coalition government so far as Tony Abbott's concerned.
Well, and Bruce, it's looking it's all aligning for the Abbott government, given that it looks as though on the state level in Tasmania that the Libs are going to get across the line.
Well, if you believe the polls, and I think I do, I think it's going to be very tough for Labor. But I suspect that this was really an exercise in wedge politics by Tony Abbott. And the reason I say that is that I think it was really aimed at trying to drive down the Labor vote and create tensions inside the Labor movement and the Labor Party. Not so much the Greens. This will actually help the Greens because it will mobilise their base, I think, and they will have something to fight about, and they'll go back to doing what we've seen happening in the forest since the 1980s, and that is, terrible confrontations and ugliness and no real outcomes.
So how is the Tasmanian Labor Party going to handle this when you've got supposedly jobs on the one side and the environment on the other?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a tough one for them, but I think they'll be able to point to the fact that the Tasmanian Forest Agreement, which was struck in 2012, actually had strong support from the business community, from the forest industry, because for the first time they were saying to the international market, look, this is wood that is not coming from these pristine areas. This is wood that's coming from areas that are already degraded. And that was of great comfort to people who wanted to buy Tasmanian wood but were worried about the source of it. And we shouldn't underestimate the significance of that. This was a case in 2012 of business, industry and unions and others coming together and saying this is a sensible outcome for the forest industry. That's why I think this is an extremely cynical move by Tony Abbott, and I think it is a case of him campaigning rather than governing yet again.
But Bruce, I think you need to look at the Tasmanian economy generally. I mean, what's it got as its industries? It's got forestry, it's got mining, it's got tourism. Tasmania can't build an economy on tourism alone, and that's essentially what they've been trying to do for the last few years. We need to expand the forestry markets there because that's where the economic future of Tasmania lies, and this is about trying to create greater economic opportunity in that state. Young people constantly leave Tasmania because there's no jobs.
But how many jobs are we talking about?
Well, there could be several hundred jobs. I'm not going to put a figure on it.
In the whole scheme of things, that doesn't amount to much, does it?
Well, in a state of only 350,000 people, with unemployment at the highest rate in the country, with not a single new job created in the last 8 years, a few hundred jobs is pretty significant.
Isn't that a sign to get creative? I mean, Glenn Stevens was talking just yesterday about how across Australia we need to be getting creative about creating new jobs. Isn't this just banging the gong or something we've already done?
People have to back their strengths, and forestry in Tasmania has always been a strength. And Bruce is right. There has been a green movement there that has basically strangled the forestry industry for the last 30 years and caused great uncertainty for investors down there. Look at all the debates we had over the last few years about the pulp mill and the regulatory uncertainty surrounding that. If people want to invest in Tasmania, if they want to create jobs, there has to be some greater uncertainty. There has to be greater certainty. There has to be greater economic opportunity.
But this is where the problem. This is where the argument falls down, Julian, because the fact is that when the pulp industry had free rein, it was collapsing. It was collapsing largely because the international markets were just very unhappy about the thought of old growth forests, pristine forests, being destroyed in this way to promote the pulp wood industry. So that's the problem that they were trying to address with the Tasmanian Forest Agreement. The chairman of the Tasmanian Forest Alliance, Industry Alliance, somebody on the business side, was a big supporter, and as far as I know continues to be a big supporter of the Tasmanian Forest Agreement, which locked up this land because they were able to then say the land that's going to be logged is going to take logs which are from old growth forest or from depleted forest, from forest that's regenerated and also not pristine in the way in which these areas that they're looking at taking away are now. So I think you've got to be careful about saying that this is something which is going to generate growth and generate industry. I don't think it's going to do that at all. I think it's going to generate conflict between the green movement and industry elements, and I think that's exactly what Tony Abbott wants to do in the lead up to the Tasmanian election.
What Tasmania needs is somebody actually to take on the green movement. And part of the reason that there was so much concern in about timber that was coming out of Tasmania was that for years people in the green movement were going round to the international markets and telling people you can't buy Tasmanian wood, it's not sustainable, and that's just rubbish. And I think what the best outcome that can happen from the Tasmanian election is the marginalisation of the Greens generally, because they continue to hold the forestry industry back for purely ideological reasons.
Well, I think you'll find actually that the international timber industry was able to make up its own mind about these things, and they knew the difference between old growth forest that was pristine, hadn't been touched in thousands of years, and new land and plantations which were quite useful for forest exports. That's the difference here. They were making up their mind about this thing, and the markets, which Julian's a great supporter of, spoke. And the forest industry was in all sorts of crisis as a result of them not going down that path of identifying the old growth forest, locking it up and saying, but the other stuff you can have.
Just very briefly, we are running out of time. I wanted to get a brief comment from both of you in regards to Peter Gresder, the Australian Al Jazeera journalist in jail in Egypt. There are appeals, certainly from him, for Tony Abbott and his government to do more to represent his case. Is the government doing enough?
Well, I saw the Prime Minister made a statement overnight in relation to this case. I know that Julie Bishop from the reports has been taking an active intervention in the case, dealing with her counterparts in Egypt. I know the Latvian government has also got involved. I think there's limited amount of consular assistance that we can provide here, but I'm sure Australia is doing the usual things it would do.
It was a strong message from Barack Obama, though. Did we need something stronger?
Look, I think Tony Abbott, himself a former journalist, made very strong comments about the importance of the freedom of the press and the freedom to criticise governments, and that's what people should be able
Bruce,
to do.
very quickly.
I think anyone that saw that image of Gresder and his colleagues in a cage in the courtroom would be absolutely chilled. Yeah. I think Australians really have to make it very clear through the government and through other representations that this is an appalling way to treat members of the media.
Bruce Hawker, Julian Leeser, thanks very much.